Aloha.
Aloha.
This is our report on crowdfunding. So what is crowdfunding? As the name correctly implies, it's a way for businesses to raise funds from a large group of investors or donors. So crowdfunding is the use of small amounts of capital from large numbers of individuals to finance new businesses. And crowdfunding makes use of easy accessibility to a vast network of people through social media and other crowdfunding websites that bring investors and entrepreneurs together. So some of the history of crowdfunding, in the 1700s, there was a socially depressed Ireland, and famous author Jonathan Swift, he developed a program to basically give loans to poor Irish families from wealthy Irish families. And so this was sort of the first idea of crowdfunding being used. And there's some smaller examples throughout history. We see really a big shift into crowdfunding in the 1970s with the development of the Grameen Bank. And the idea behind the Grameen Bank was to offer credit to poor people who do not live in areas with developed banking systems or could not qualify for loans because of lack of collateral. The Bank of Grameen primarily served then women or minority groups who would not be able to get traditional financing. This is basically the first idea of microloans. And then from there, in 2001, we really see the first platform of crowdfunding developed in the digital sphere. And it was a program called Artist Share. And artists could crowdfund for their sculptures or paintings. And then this really launched the industry, where now we have companies like Indiegogo, Kickstarter, GoFundMe, and Kiva, and all these various crowdfunding sources, and they serve different types of crowdfunding, such as debt, equity, or donation, which we'll get into.
Okay. So some of the different crowdfunding models that we have right now are equity-based, reward-based, lending-based, and donation-based. So it seems for a lot of us, we may be more familiar with donation-based because a lot of our interactions with individuals and businesses are, as Logan mentioned, some of the main crowdfunding companies are those ones that we're more familiar with. But as you can see, equity-based is based more for investors. You're kind of seeing like the sale of the security. A reward-based, you have the expectations that, they'll receive something. So if you're paying for something, you're going to get something back. Lending-based, this deals with debt. So usually most likely like personal loans and things like that. And then lastly, you have donation-based, which is like the ones where you don't expect anything, you're just donating to donate. So some examples that we mentioned earlier, like GoFundMe, Indiegogo, Kickstarter, Facebook, and Fundly. And there's many, many more too. So just some of their awareness in markets, how people may be aware of them or just aware like of competitors and others. The first one's advancement of technology. And so we know that this is using through like social media and online resources. It's a way you can gather donations from around the world. The second one is the ability to receive feedback. So you can reach more audience and you can kind of evaluate, you can see what works and what doesn't work. They can ask questions, they can kind of just interact with you in that way. And then lastly, you have those increased costs from the advancement of technologies. And so you have to be aware that it can be expensive to like be able to, to advertise what you're trying to receive donations for. And so that's one thing you have to be aware of. And so problems before crowdfunding became a thing was there was limited number of possible sources. You had high interest rates, need for well-developed business and product, loss of ownership and control, and limits for non-US entrepreneurs. And so this is kind of how we talked about kind of the history, how it kind of led up to this point.
Okay, so some of the benefits of crowdfunding that I just want to highlight here is that you get to, one, create financial backing and avoid big bank loans with heavy interest rates. And with that, you can lower and mitigate the risk, and also be able to raise funds quickly. With many of the online platforms that there are now, we can raise funds a lot faster and reach more investors. And you can also build a strong support system from donors and the community as one of the other benefits there are for crowdfunding. And also just mention in there that you'll be able to have a more effective risk management. Just some of the risks of crowdfunding, though, is that one, equity dilution. For those of you who don't know what dilution means, equity dilution is reducing the ownership percentage of existing shareholders. Another risk is obviously having startups that are risky. All startups are usually risky, and so they have a higher risk of failure. And then there's also risk of fraud. So a lot of fraudsters might use asymmetric information to deceive many investors to raise funds for things that aren't real. And so those are just some things to look out for crowdfunding.
So now, as we've looked at some of the risks and benefits of crowdfunding, like many things in the economy and in the market, we've seen innovation, we've seen failures, and we've seen the many different uses of crowdfunding. And because of that, we have come up with regulations, or the SEC has been able to come up with regulations to help crowdfunders, crowdfunding platforms, and those companies who are hoping to receive crowdfunding donations to be able to work flawlessly as much as they can. And so, as we see under the Jobs Act, which is the Jumpstart Our Business Startup Act, we have certain regulations which you can actually find on the Code of Federal Regulations. And you can look up each of those regulations, and you can find that there is a certain a maximum amount of funding that's allowed dependent on the circumstance of your business or your startup that you wanted to do. And they even have whether or not accredited, which is an individual or an investor who meets a certain net income limit. It determines whether or not they can invest or they can donate money, or whether or not they cannot. And so here are some of the crowdfunding investment limits, especially if you're investing in a company that might be working with securities markets and exchanges. They have a certain amount of annual income that they need to meet, as well as a specific net worth. And based on that, they have a limit as to how much they're allowed to donate.
Okay, so technology and the internet has played a big role in crowdfunding, in the crowdfunding market. And how it works here, as shown in the picture, is that a startup will use a crowdfunding platform, and they'll offer securities of the company in return for financing from a number of potential investors. So instead of relying on a small group of investors for large sums of financing, targets more of a broader group of investors. Some of the benefits of this, as I'd mentioned, for equity crowdfunding, is that you'll have easier access to capital. There's less pressure on management, and there's definitely a lot more lucrative returns in doing this. So here's just a bar graph of the number of portals that have increased between 2009 to 2015. As you can see, it's grown exponentially and has increased in popularity, as it has honestly become a more viable source of receiving financing for businesses. So this one's interesting. This picture kind of shows you of the revenue that of crowdfunding per region. And I just want to highlight the two biggest ones there, North America and Asia. That's the top two, 17.2 billion and 10.54 billion. And the next slide here is interesting. If you go into the next slide, it goes into the equity crowdfunding in the global markets. So the other one talked about the revenue, and this one talks about more about the spending on equity crowdfunding. And as you can see here, Far East and China are number one. And so over time, they've actually increased their spending and are using more equity crowdfunding and as a way of starting up more businesses. Companies like Midea Group, it's a home electric appliance maker, are turning to using crowdfunding. It's to be able to fund their business. And then also EcoFlow, another Chinese manufacturer of portable batteries, have been using US crowdfunding platforms to gain more financing. And so that 2023, that projected equity crowdfunding is interesting because 70% of the spending will be in that Asia and Far East region. So here's one successful crowdfunding story. Many of you maybe have heard of this game or have played it. It's Exploding Kittens. It's another version of Russian roulette. So players take turns drawing cards until you draw an exploding kitten. And if you do so, you lose the game. This was published back in 2015. It was a Kickstarter project that was seeking for $10,000 in crowdfunding. And it exceeded its goal in just 8 minutes, which is insane. They had around 219,000 donors give to the cause, and they raised 8.7 million in revenue.
And I'm sure you're all familiar with Peloton. It's another great success story of crowdfunding. So they also used Kickstarter and were able to launch their business, I believe in 2013, where they had 297 donors and raised $307,000, which really allowed them to develop the technology behind Peloton, and then launch the company. And we know today it's become just a huge success, especially during the holidays. So as you can see, crowdfunding's really increased the market for businesses to be able to go out and grow their companies and receive funding. And so we're looking forward to seeing more companies use this, especially as the government comes in and implements more regulations. I think you'll see businesses turn to this, especially as interest rates increase. So thank you.